Welcome to, this is our fourth webinar in the series for vendors. And today we're going to be talking about creating an accessibility conformance report. So let me start by putting the full link to the slide deck into the chat. You do not need to have that pulled up, but certainly I encourage you to bookmark that. The shortcut link is also on this first slide that I'm sharing, go.ncdpi.gov/access vendors ACR. So welcome. I'm so bad with names, so forgive me. Just a quick scroll through the list of who's with us today. I can't remember if some of you have been able to join us for any of the other webinars in the series. If so, welcome back. If this is your first one, please know that the recordings, the presentations, all of the resources will be shared out with anyone who has registered for any of the webinars following the last one. I already have a few of the recordings up and posted on my website, so you're welcome to peruse those if you'd like. And I have linked the slide decks from the first three sessions in today's slide deck. So that's kind of the cadence that I have for each of the presentations, as I'm trying to ensure that you've got the links from the previous sessions already embedded. So welcome again. My name is Donna Murray, and I serve as the first ever digital accessibility specialist at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So I have served as a classroom teacher. I've served at the district level for about a decade, and I'm finishing up the last third of my career at the state agency, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So I've been there for actually over a decade now. I think I'm on my 11th year, and have been focused in on all things digital content, and specifically through the lens of digital accessibility for a number of years now. But fortunately, we were able to, as an agency, commit to a full-time position for this role. And I was honored and thrilled to transition from my previous role in digital teaching and learning to a full-time focus on digital accessibility. So let's see. Oops. There we go. So in today's session, we're going to dive into an accessibility conformance report and talk about some things that, at least through my experiences, have been some things that I needed the ACR to tell me. The information that I'm looking for when I'm going out and reviewing an accessibility conformance report. And I'll share with you some of the red flags that and we'll talk about the quote unquote red flags and really what that means. It doesn't mean that it's a deal breaker. What it means is that we need to have some follow-up conversations with a vendor. We need to make sure that we're really getting the full story of a vendor's accessibility of their product. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to talk about really just some best practices for completing and developing that accessibility conformance report. So let's jump right in. Oh, well, just kidding. Let me first point you in the direction of those slide decks from the first three sessions. So we started out the series just as a broad introduction for vendors for digital accessibility. We talked about related laws. We talked about related standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG standards. And we talked about some basic accessibility strategies that really apply to just about every kind of digital content. Our second session was about really defining the current landscape. Like, where are we in the world of accessibility when it comes to not only our products, but the culture of our company? So we focused in on that, and I created and shared some resources with you for a self-assessment. And then the next webinar, we kind of took that self-assessment, our findings from our current landscape, and said, now what? Where do we go from here? How do we prioritize this work? How do we build a roadmap for moving forward? And how do we track our progress? And so last week's webinar was really focused around creating that accessibility plan. So again, the slide decks are chock full of resources for you. And the recordings, I have all three of those recordings already posted and ready to go on my website, as well as my YouTube channel. So that's kind of where we've been so far. And then today's conversation is that deeper dive into an accessibility conformance report. So let's talk about what a VPAT is. And some of this may not be new to you, but if it's not, then this will be your refresher. What is a VPAT? It actually stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. But what I have found, as you may have found too in the land of accessibility, is that we often call the completed template a VPAT. So we kind of use that interchangeably. In fact, I think that, yeah, on the next slide I have VPAT versus ACR. We usually hear those used interchangeably. So the template itself is something that was developed kind of as an industry standard from the Information Technology Industry Council. Their acronym is actually just ITI, but the council has developed a number of these industry standard accessibility templates. And the screenshot that I have here on the right of this slide has the most recent ones. You can see that they're dated from November of 23. And the one that we're going to focus in on today is that VPAT 2.5 that relates to the WCAG standards. So there's one for the European standards, there's one for international standards. There's one specifically related to Section 508 of the Rehab Act, one that's aligned to WCAG, and then there's another resource that tracks changes. So the WCAG one, the reason we're going to focus in on that is, and I encourage you to go back and watch the intro session if you're not familiar with the related regulatory rules that came out in 2024, specifically the one that's related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA Title II states that any state and local government entity, and that includes public education entities, any state and local government entity has to ensure that their services, activities, and programs are equally accessible to people with disabilities. And the rule helps clarify what the ADA has been saying since 1990 when it became law. And it's given us a technical standard to meet. And that's why the VPAT is so important and so kind of has become the industry standard, especially for us in the US, because we've had this technical standard, this industry standard of the WCAG guidelines for a number of years now. And the ADA Title II rule has said this is going to be the bar for state and local government. So it's important that we're, of course, as we're creating our accessibility conformance report, that we're using the right VPAT. So we would be looking at VPAT 2.5, the WCAG version of the VPAT. And really, again, it's a template. It's it is the industry standard, but it is a template with the intent that vendors are going to be telling their story of accessibility and their level of conformance with those WCAG standards. And then the final product would be an accessibility conformance report. But again, we often still call that the VPAT, even when it's completed. Whatever we call it, just know that these two are somewhat interchangeable. I say somewhat because a VPAT is just, I think, one part of an accessibility story. It's just usually that the requirements in procurements that you might have gone through, that's usually kind of the litmus test for accessibility is tell us your story via a completed VPAT. And today I'm going to challenge us to think even beyond a VPAT and talk about what else we might want to include in an accessibility conformance report to fully tell the story. All right, so one of the resources that I've created for you is this guiding document, throwing the link in the chat here, that really helps you. It's basically today's presentation in a guidebook format. So really what I've done here is just created a guidebook for you to help you through that process of, kind of an understanding of the WCAG standards, and then diving into, where do we start? What are kind of the things we need to do to prep for creating this ACR? And then a deeper dive into the parts of the VPAT, and then the considerations that we need to have in mind as we're completing the VPAT. And a reminder, I think I said this multiple times in the guide, is how important transparency is. Because as we're talking about red flags today, I want to challenge us to think about them through the lens of being better with our transparency. The clearer we can tell our story of accessibility, even if it means that we are just starting out with accessibility in our development process, maybe we've still got a lot of remediation left to do. The clearer we can tell that story to our customers, the better we're both going to be in moving forward with contractual work. If we're going to be, I'm kind of switching roles now. If I, as an education or a local state government entity, is looking to partner with a vendor because we found value in your product as a solution for our needs, if we get down the road and then I realize that I didn't have a complete picture of your accessibility story, then we're having to retroactively have conversations about how to fix that. So let's be transparent as we can up front about the true landscape of accessibility. I don't see that personally as a red flag. Just because you're not compliant yet doesn't mean that we can't work together to collaboratively develop that roadmap and a timeline. In fact, the next week's webinar is really going to focus in on that collaboration, because I believe that we really are not going to move forward in the landscape of accessibility and make the progress that we need in the time that we need to without a true partnership between an organization, a customer, and the vendor themselves. So anyway, this guide is kind of the document version, if you will, of today's presentation. So it does, of course, talk about, like I mentioned, the WCAG standards, or at least an overview about how to get a game plan together of how you're going to do the evaluation of your products, and then kind of walks you through some of the tips and tricks and strategies for completing that VPAT to make an ACR. So there are basically the structure of the VPAT itself is basically broken into kind of an introduction section where you're kind of laying out the framework of, this is the version of the product that we've tested. These are the user interfaces that we've tested. Here's the evaluation methods that we used to create our VPAT. And then the full section of tables where we get to really dive into a specific WCAG standard. The WCAG standards are actually called success criteria, but I use the term standard interchangeably with that. So the WCAG standards are built into tables for you to describe the level of support or the level of compliance that you have. And then I think an even more important space is the space where you can include remarks and explanation that tell why you're saying this is our conformance level. We're either all in, we've supported it completely, there's no exceptions, or we feel like it's not applicable to our product. Whatever your conformance level is, it's so important that we're really detailing in that remarks section the story, the full, as much as possible, the detail of why we've selected that conformance level. So let's take a look at, this is just a screenshot of that WCAG version of the VPAT. And again, that top part is just a place for you to kind of tell the story of your document itself. Who is it? What product are you, or, your company, your product, your version of your product, how you evaluated it, and then noting which WCAG standards that you're going to be addressing. Now, for the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, the standard has been set to meet WCAG 2.1, level A and AA. So the VPAT template, well, that's redundant. The VPAT version, the WCAG version of the VPAT here, includes everything from 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. So in some instances, you may find that you're just removing any of the standards that don't apply to whatever procurement you're responding to. So for example, NCDPI, when we're putting out a procurement in our solicitation language, we're saying we need you to be able to meet or tell how you're going to meet in a timely manner WCAG 2.1, A and AA. But the template itself is designed so that if you're, whatever standards you're going to address, it will include A, AA, AAA, and every version from 2.0 to 2.1 to 2.2. So, the point here is that you can kind of take out the standards that don't apply to the required level that you're reporting on. Let's see, I see a question in the chat. Is it standard or recommended to have a third-party accessibility? That's a great question. And actually, I talk about that a couple times in today's presentation. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Let me go ahead and address it a little bit now, April, while the questions posed. So I think there's definitely benefit to having a third-party evaluation. What I see is the challenge when I've seen third-party evaluations that are part of a solicitation response is that the vendor doesn't understand the evaluation. In other words, you've had a third party who's completed this VPAT on your behalf, and I appreciate that then you've got this kind of external, non-biased review of your content. That's fantastic. But if at the end of the day, the VPAT comes back to your company and you don't have a true understanding of what that VPAT's saying, then it's just a document. It's certainly given me a technical conformance lens into your product. But if I can't ask follow-up questions because there's not anyone in the company that can speak to the VPAT responses, then to me, it's just a document. So that's my take on it, April, is it's definitely, I think, there's benefits to having that third party evaluation. And I know that there's a wide array of companies out there that can provide that service and do it well. And I appreciate that and love that as an opportunity for your company to get that, that external lens, that external review of your content. But be mindful that the end goal is we still need the company to be able to understand and help, and have a clear idea of what that report is telling them. So one of the things that I have that we'll talk about kind of towards the end of today's presentation is a resource design that's for the procurement team. So even though our webinar series, of course, is about the vendor lens to accessibility, I'm going to show you that resource because I want you to understand, at least from my viewpoint and my experiences, what I'm looking for when I'm going through, a statewide procurement, for example, and how I'm reviewing that VPAT and how I'm trying to build capacity with people who may not have that technical knowledge around accessibility. So as a non-techie person, what would I expect other procurement team members to be able to do with a VPAT if they don't have a technical subject matter expert for accessibility that can do a review? In other words, how can you tell your accessibility story that's not, that's, you know, that's techie, that's really covering that technical conformance piece, but also written in enough plain language that someone who's not techie is able to at least be able to comprehend the story that you're telling, to be able to identify gaps, and then be able to pose some questions for further discussion back to the vendor. And and that's tough because some of the WCAG standards are very technical, but I've seen enough what I call good VPATs versus a lot of red flags to recognize that when we're as detailed and as transparent as possible, and when we're using plain language as much as possible, and especially in that kind of that first lens procurement, when you're submitting your bids, um, the more transparent you can be, the more detailed you can be, the easier it is on the procurement side to be able to really get a good idea of where you are and what discussion points need to guide our conversation next. Let's see. April, thanks. Seems like it would be helpful from a state agency perspective to see the third-party review and understand whether the vendor has a plan to fix any issues identified before completing a contract. Absolutely, I agree with that. Again, I think the third-party review can be a tremendous part of a bid response and can certainly drive conversations around, you know, that planned roadmap. But it can't be a standalone document. It's got to be something that internally the company is able to understand and act upon. So yes, I'm on the same page with you with that. All right, so the conformance levels themselves are currently written in the VPAT as these terms. And I'll be honest, sometimes I struggle with these terms because I think sometimes I've seen it doesn't seem that there's a clear understanding of when to use which term. But again, this is where providing as much detail as possible in the remarks section is so important. Instead of just telling me it supports, tell me what you mean by that. To, you know, give me some examples of how that standard is being supported. So these are the conformance levels that are built out into that template. Supports, basically it's saying there's at least one way that this criteria is being met. You know, again, they're called success criteria, but I often call them standards. So whichever language works for you, just know that I'm using those interchangeably. So at least one method meets that success criteria or that standard without known defects, or it meets with equivalent facilitation. And that can be kind of a tricky space because I need to understand exactly how a standard is being supported. So if there's any way that you can detail, you know, how it's being supported without any defects, or if there's some way that you are meeting that standard as an equivalent facilitation, the more detail that you can be, the better it is for a procurement team in their review to be able to really understand the full scope and to be able to ask any follow-up questions. The partially supports is where some functionality does not meet the criteria. And I'll be frank with you. I'm going off of some experiences that I've had in reviewing VPATs, not just with procurement that I've been through, but just in reviewing VPATs that I've looked for online. So I don't want to say that my only experiences have been just with procurements at the state level. Oftentimes when I'm looking at a resource, the first thing I do is look at your accessibility statement. I do a quick auto eval of your home webpage. And I look to see if you have a public facing VPAT. And that's just kind of a few litmus tests that I take personally. That's just kind of part of my workflow. It doesn't tell me obviously the full story of accessibility of a company. And it definitely isn't a deal breaker on how those are, but it kind of gives me it gives me a first lens into the accessibility commitment and compliance of a product. So when I look at a VPAT and it says supports for one of the standards, but then right beside it in the remarks, it says something to the effect of almost all of da 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 meet this functionality, or everything meets this criteria except for. Well, honestly, that doesn't meet the definition of support. That would be more of partially supports. But again, you can see how if you're translating as supports as, well, 99% of our stuff meets this criteria, that tells me, to me, that's an advocacy point for how important the detail section is, because we may have a little bit of subjectivity in how we're using those terms, but the detail section can really help tell the full story. Now, it does not support, obviously, is majority of the functionality does not meet. Again, that's somewhat subjective, because you may say, well, majority for us may sound may be defined differently than the majority of the functionality through the lens of the procurement team. Not applicable is just how it sounds. The criteria is not relevant. But what I have seen is that sometimes it is relevant, but I have no detail on why you've said it's not. So for example, I've seen sometimes where a VPAT says that alt text for images, for non-text content, is not applicable. And most digital content that I come across, especially if I know what kind of solution that we're looking for, has images. So it's kind of a red flag for me to see that you're saying it's not applicable, that you don't have any images that need alt text. So even if something is noted as not applicable, I encourage you to give some more detail to that on why you're saying it doesn't apply. One of the things that's noted in the template is that sometimes supports is used when someone is noting that it's not applicable. And in the template, kind of the instruction section, the narrative section, it references that, and it says sometimes supports is used when something is not applicable, because to the extent that it is applicable, we support it. It just happens in this case that it's not applicable. So that's kind of a tricky space too. If you're saying it supports it, but really what you're meaning is it's not applicable, by the, I guess by the letter of the standard, you are compliant. But I really need to know, are you saying that it's not applicable, or are you saying that you support it because it is applicable? So I know I'm sounding like I'm on repeat here, but this again, it just reiterates why it's important to be as detailed as we can in the explanations. All right, and then of course, not evaluated is included as a conformance level, but really this is just for like the AAA standards, or the AAA level of criteria. And sometimes when I'm looking at a VPAT, those specific standards have just been deleted from the template. So if you do leave AAA standards in, but you've not evaluated against them, because generally, I think you'll probably find that customers are looking for a minimum of that A and AA, and that, AAA is great if you're meeting it, but it may not be set as a requirement. So either adios those standards altogether from the template if that works best for you, or you could simply denote that they've not been evaluated. Okay. So this is just a screenshot of the success criteria tables. So the way that they're structured in the VPAT as it stands, if you downloaded it from ITI right now, you'll see that the WCAG VPAT has a table for A, a different table for AA standards, and then a separate table for AAA standards. So in that instance, if you're not evaluating against AAA, you could just delete that third table if that's the way you want to go about it. But one of the things that's noted in the narrative of the VPAT from ITI is that if it makes more sense to tell your accessibility story in a VPAT by reordering these by standard number, rather than having a table for A, a table for AA, and possibly the table for AAA, then you can do that. So they're encouraging you to think about what's the best way to tell our story. Should we address all the A standards first and then all the AA standards next? Or should we reorder the table so that we've got 1.1.1, 1.1.2, but that we continue on through whether it's A or AA, we put them in numerical order because the standards themselves are ordered in such a way that they're grouped in such a way that they complement each other within each section. So we have all of the standards that are specific to making content perceivable is all grouped together, A, AA, AAA. So if it makes more sense to put them in numerical order, then you could certainly do that. It's just that the template itself is divided into tables by level. Now, Donna Murray would prefer, this is just Donna talking, but I prefer to have all the standards in numerical order because as we'll see in the next, in part of our slide deck today, we'll talk about how some of the standards build off each other. So generally, when we talk about A, AA, and AAA standards, we're getting more stringent as we go. There's more requirement built in, or the level of requirement. Maybe there's less exceptions, or maybe there's it's just a more stringent expectation for things like hyperlinks. So at AA, we're expected to make sure that a hyperlink is descriptive, or we've got enough context nearby that we understand what that hyperlink is going to take us to. Level AAA states that that link needs to be able to stand alone by itself. It needs to have enough context and be descriptive enough that I could take those linked words and put that in front of you, and you have a good idea of where it's going to take you. So you can see that that next level is just a bit more stringent. So to me, it makes more sense for me to be able to see the progression of those levels that you've addressed, and the way to do that would be in numerical order. Now, that wouldn't stop me from being able to compare those across tables, but that's just Donna Murray's lens into how she, in her workflow, how she would like to be able to process that information. So the remarks and explanation section. So I keep referencing this. This is a place for us to, again, tell the story of what your conformance level that you've determined to be. It's the explanation part. It's a place for you to really give me some greater detail into the features and functionality that either support or don't support, or let me rephrase that are supported or not supported within your solution. So let me talk a little bit about what to include in those remarks. So I'm going to skip supports for a minute, and you'll see I have a statement there that's italicized. I'm going to jump down to partially supports. So this is language that's straight from the template itself. This is what ITI has put directly into the instructions in the top part of the VPAT. If something is partially supported, that's your compliance level that you've determined, then in the explanation part, this is a space for you to identify the features and the functions that have issues and how they're not fully supported, which makes sense. Tell the story of what's not accessible, what doesn't conform with that standard. The does not support, same thing. We want to identify what has issues and how it's not fully supported. I would recommend, if it's feasible and makes sense in your accessibility story, to go ahead and talk about what's your game plan for how you're working to address this. What part of the roadmap have you put this in? to address this? Or what are the challenges that you're facing to, maybe if this is if your accessibility journey is new and you're having to do a lot of remediation rather than developing with accessibility in mind proactively, then it might be difficult to think about how, to kind of have a game plan of how this is going to be addressed. Maybe you're going to be waiting until the next iteration of your product before you're able to address it. If so, and you know that, then tell that. This just gives us a better understanding of what challenges we may face and what we need to address in our roadmap to ensure that people with accessibilities in the meantime, how they're still going to have access. What are the alternatives? And then, of course, if it's not applicable, especially if you put support instead of NA, explain that. Why are you saying that's not applicable? Do you really not have any images anywhere in your product user interface? So these are spelled out in the template themselves. The supports section here where I have a phrase in italics, this is my addition. This was not included in the narrative of the VPAT. So this is just Donna Murray talking. I would suggest that you also explain the features and functionality that are supported and give some examples. I love when a vendor says, we support the standard fully, but I need more information than that. As much as possible, give a few examples, especially if there's multiple interfaces, especially if you know that we're looking at a particular part of your library of solutions and who our audience is going to be, who our end users are going to be. If you can provide some examples, that also can help us when we're thinking about what our demo script is going to be when we're posing questions to you during a demonstration, for example. So as much as possible, be as detailed as you can. I will try not to say that too many more times today because I think I've made my point, but it's really about, the whole point of the VPAT is to explain where you are. What is the landscape of accessibility of your product? Where are you compliant and where are you not? So use that as an opportunity to tell your story. Now, the VPAT has lots of benefits, but there's also some limitations. And April, this kind of goes back to your point when we talk about limitations here, about that third-party eval. So the benefit is it's a great first lens. It's kind of like the other litmus tests that I use when I'm looking at an accessibility commitment statement, when I'm looking at just doing a quick auto eval of a website. And then I'm also looking at that VPAT. It's a good initial lens into a product's accessibility. It's a great conversation starter. Again, this is, the more detailed you can be, the more direct my questions can be when I'm posing those to you, rather than just coming back in our first conversation being, I need more detail. If you can include that as much as possible, that's going to move us forward in our next conversation. Now, there are some limitations, and one of those, to April's point, that third-party eval, if the only lens that I have is that you've self-reported, then I'm gonna need to really, I'm gonna expect you, like in the demonstrations or in our follow-up conversations, to provide some additional evidence that you really are compliant, rather than just telling me in this checklist document. So it's, the self-reporting means that there might be a need for some additional clarification or verification of your notes of compliance. And of course, it can lack detail. It might be that you didn't have that third-party validation. Maybe there's a good reason for that. That may be absolutely fine if you feel like you've got that internal knowledge and skill set to complete the VPAT internally. I don't have a problem with that. If you have the skills and experience and the subject matter experts on hand and can justify the conformance levels that you've selected. It's also important to note that, a VPAT may not tell me the full story of how you've evaluated. You may say, well, the evaluation was done internally, or the evaluation was done by a third party. But that still doesn't tell me if you've only done an automated test, if you've done a manual test, or if you've tested with users with disabilities. And it may not even tell me that I totally lost my train of thought. If you've used any assistive technology devices in your testing, any screen readers, things like that. But it also can, oh man, I had a really important point. Hold that thought. Detail test. In the top part, when you're talking about the testing piece, it may not even be giving me enough detail about what version of the products that you've tested or what user interfaces you've tested. One of the things that I have found is kind of a red flag. Again, red flag doesn't mean deal breaker. It just means that I'm going to have some follow-up questions. Is that if you haven't told me exactly what user interface that you're addressing, but I know that there's 3 different user interfaces, or maybe there's also a mobile app that goes along with this product, then the first thing I'm going to come back and ask is, what did you review? You told me the version, but I still don't know which user interfaces are being addressed here. So that's really going to be, driving our very first conversation is that I don't have enough detail. So it's helpful when we're thinking about VPATs to understand that it is a good first lens into the accessibility of the product, but it can't be the only part of the conversation. It's usually the first thing that we look at, especially in a bid response when we're thinking about accessibility. That's usually why we require it. But it's just the starting point. So let's make it as transparent and detailed as possible so that we are ready to jump into the next conversation when we talk. So here are some, what I call features of a good, quote unquote, good VPAT. Maybe the better term is effective. Here we go again, details as much as possible. It's specific examples, not just of what meets the standard, but where your gaps are. Letting me know what your user testing or your, whatever your feedback loop is for users with disabilities and their testing, letting me know the results of those. It may not be that that's built in within the tables of the VPAT. Maybe you have a separate narrative that says, this is how we evaluated. There's like this little section at the top of the VPAT. But again, sometimes I just see things that say, we completed this internally, or we had a third party. But that doesn't tell me the full methodologies that you used for creating the VPAT. So if there's an opportunity tell us how you involved users with disabilities and what the results of that feedback loop was, even better. Because it's, again, more transparent and giving us a lot of information that may save us from having to ask that question the next time we meet. As much detail up front, the better. If you're, again, transparent, that's so helpful. Addressing all user interfaces. Sometimes that may mean that you need multiple VPATs because you've got a mobile app, but you also have the web version, and the functionality and features of those are different enough that it warrants having 2 separate VPATs. If it doesn't make sense to capture that all in one, then I absolutely encourage you to have a separate VPAT for different applications and for different user interfaces. And again, it might be helpful to have that third-party verification. That certainly depends on the priorities and the structure of how you address your accessibility evaluations. All right, so I'm going to say red flags again, but that's just a term that I'm using to talk about really just flags. It's just a note to me that we need to have additional conversations because I don't have a complete picture. But these are some things that do throw up that flag for me. One, if it's an outdated VPAT. So if you have a VPAT from last year, but you have done a tremendous amount of, well, not even a tremendous amount. If you've done a decent amount of changes, updates within your product, then that VPAT really is not helpful to me. So if it's outdated, to me, it's just as good as not having one. Because if you've made a lot of changes, it doesn't necessarily mean that the accessibility has improved. So the VPAT is not really helpful. It doesn't give me a good lens into the current landscape. Here I go again. Detail matters. So the generic vague descriptions aren't really helpful because I'm going to have a lot of follow-up questions to help me understand exactly what you mean by those descriptions. Things like telling me it supports, but not really giving me any idea of some examples of what you mean by that. That's a red flag. Using not applicable a lot. There's certainly sometimes, depending on the type of digital content that you have, that's part of your solution. So if it's something that's very interactive, you are likely going to need to meet every single standard that WCAG has. But maybe the only thing that's included in your solution are a collection of training videos. So in that instance, not all of the WCAG standards are going to be applicable. And that's fine. But if you're using not applicable for a lot of the standards, and I know that the full scope of your solution is that it's very interactive for the user to be able to complete and forms, and maybe there's a data dashboard that's interactive. If I know going in that that's the type of solution we're looking for, and a lot of the WCAG standards you've listed on the VPAT say not applicable, then I'm gonna have a lot of follow-up questions. So be detailed or be prepared to clarify. Does not support. This is an opportunity for you to be transparent. If it doesn't support, okay. But let's talk about what's your game plan. Do you have a roadmap already? Are you, in our next webinar, we're going to talk about how to engage with your customers to help build and prioritize that roadmap, because that's a win-win for everyone. So that's a red flag. If you've not told me any story about how you're planning on addressing those that are not supported. And another thing is contradiction in responses. And we're going to look at an example of this in just a moment. In fact, let's just jump to that. Basically, what I'm saying here is that there are some standards that go hand in hand. So if you tell me this supports, but this one doesn't support, then that's a red flag for me. So here's just a few examples of kind of a detailed versus not detailed response. So for that non-text content, we're thinking about like alt text for images. The partially supports response here. If I didn't have this detailed explanation, I would certainly have a lot of questions. But this is, I think, a good example of a detailed response that's telling me all the types of non-text content that you have, icons, buttons, form controls, that they do have alt text or the ARIA labels, that there is an exception, that there are some infographics in the dashboard that don't have alt text, and then you've given me a lens into what's being done about that. It's being remediated. Our goal is to have that done in our fourth quarter. An example of not sufficient response is that it supports, and you simply said all images have alt text. And in your mind, that may be, we've supported it. We're telling them even in simple language, we've got alt text for all of our images. But I know that in your product, you have more things than just images. You have some buttons and some form controls, and I need to have more information about whether or not you've met this standard for those examples of non-text. So just, again, be detailed as much as possible. Another example here, this is explaining how you are meeting 2.1.1, which is around keyboard navigation accessibility. And in here, again, it's partially supported, and I have detail about what is not supported at this time, how that's going to be included in a future patch to resolve the issue. And in this instance, this example, we're even getting information about how user testing was used. And again, it may not, you may decide that that you're not going to include that within the VPAT tables, but instead maybe you're going to have a narrative that says this is our process for testing, and that includes this feedback loop with users with disabilities. And of course, a poor example of this response would be not applicable, because honestly, in most cases, the whatever user interface that you have developed needs to be keyboard accessible. So I'm going to have a lot of questions about your response of not applicable. All right, so now let's talk about a couple of contradictions. So in this instance, this kind of goes along with that previous slide about keyboard navigation. If you're telling me that you do not support currently keyboard navigation, you're noting that not all interactive components are operable by a keyboard. But then later on in 2.4.7, which is the AA standard that relates to keyboard accessibility, one of them, you've said it does support, because you've said that as someone is using a keyboard and they're navigating through with just their keyboard, they are able to see, by usually it's like an outline that shows me where I am on the screen. You're telling me that the focus indicator is present? That contradicts what you just told me in 2.1.1 when you said that it's not keyboard accessible. I can't have focus indicators that are present and consistent if it's not keyboard accessible to begin with. So this is an example of why I like the standards to be in numerical order rather than A and AA in separate tables. Because one of the first things that I'm going to do when I'm doing a review is look for any contradictions. So I'm going to have to look back from, compare this table to this table to do that. I can do that, but it really helps me when it's in numerical order, because then I can quickly take a look at all of those keyboard related standards together and see if they truly do match, if there's a contradiction or not. Here's another example of contradiction. If you're saying that info in relationships is not supported, so you're saying that things like your form labels and your headings, or maybe your ARIA roles are missing, or we haven't applied them correctly, but then you're telling me in 2.4.6 that you're supported, that all headings and labels are meaningful and that they've all been properly labeled as such, they're properly implemented. That's a contradiction. So again, helping, this tells me that someone's not understanding the true meaning, what it means to be conformant for these two different standards, because they're contradicting each other. So I'm gonna have a lot of follow-up questions for the vendor on something like that. Now, here's some more potential red flags. Obviously, if there's missing or incomplete sections, if you are not telling me that there's been any users with disabilities involved in your feedback, again, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it tells me that these are things that we're going to need to address as we're going through the procurement and implementation of the solution, so that we can make sure that that's part of the plan moving forward. This is that one that depends on the scope and structure of your company and how you're prioritizing this work. The lack of an external evaluation can be a red flag, because I'm really having to rely on this internal self-assessment. So my follow-up questions are going to be, can I really get a clear idea of the subject matter expertise on your team that completed the VPAT? If you're going to make a case that we didn't need an external eval, then I'm going to be asking some questions to see that you really do understand and have evaluated well your products. Overemphasis on future improvements. I can't tell you how many times I go to a website and in the accessibility commitment, it will say, we are committed to accessibility and we are working on, ensuring that we are compliant with WCAG 2.1. And then it'll have a date from like 2020. Okay, I need to know what you've done since then. Like, what's your timeline? What's your roadmap? What have you done so far? To really get an idea of your commitment and to understand how you're, what's the game plan for future improvements. I don't want to hear about how you're committed to it and you've got all these future plans unless I have a really clear understanding of where you've been, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. Obviously, if I ask for a VPAT and your company says, well, we don't have one, we're going to have to look into that. That's a red flag for me because it's telling me that you're not aware of industry standards and that potentially you don't even know what you don't know about accessibility. So certainly that's going to be cause for a further conversation. And this kind of comes back again to that third party evaluation. If you can't clarify your claims, if I'm on a call with a vendor and I'm asking questions about accessibility and they say, well, this isn't really my lane, I'm going to have to, that's kind of a red flag for me. Now, certainly there's going to be some subject matter experts that might be needed to clarify some technical aspects of a VPAT response. Absolutely understandable. But generally, if everyone within your company should be able to, at least to some degree, be able to tell the story about your accessibility commitment, what works, what functions aren't accessible, and your roadmap for what you're working on. Again, not everyone is going to have that level of expertise and be a subject matter expert across the board with accessibility. But I challenge you to think about the fact that everyone has a role and responsibility for accessibility in your company and should be able to articulate, at least in general terms, the claims that you're making in the VPAT. Okay. Anyone who has joined one of my webinars so far knows that give Donna an hour, and she really means an hour and 10 minutes. So please, if you need to jump off the call at the top of the hour, please know that the recording will be available following. And just as I've mentioned in previous webinars, if you're going to join the next two webinars, please try to block out about an hour and 10 minutes because Donna Murray has a tough time keeping to her timetable. Yes, April. April says, please make sure sales folks know something about accessibility. Absolutely. In fact, in the previous couple of webinars, I've shared a roles and responsibilities document. So I encourage you to take a look at that because it might be a good discussion starter for your company to say, what are the roles and responsibilities for all of our teams, including like customer support team, our sales team, our development team, our leadership team, and then how can we collaborate across teams so that we're all on the same page? It is important. Absolutely. I agree with you on that, April. So this guidance document that I mentioned way back at the beginning of our session, that I had created a guidance document for procurement teams. And while it's not through the lens of a vendor, I think this could be a helpful tool for you too, to see what I am encouraging our evaluation teams to be doing when they're looking at a VPAT. In other words, I'm pointing out those red flags, things that they need to be looking for. I'm talking about some processes for them for the review of the VPAT and how to capture their findings. So if this is, and of course this is Donna Murray's lenses into the procurement process, but it's from a space of experience. So these are some of the things that I know we need to start addressing, at least within my agency. And it's certainly things that I have seen even with some of our school districts that they need to start building in as part of their processes. So I have some key questions to consider for a procurement team. And these are a few things, just a couple notes for, if you're a non-techie, you can still review a VPAT. And notice one of the things I encourage is to look for the detail because that helps tell the story. And then I even have a list of some of those common contradictions. So that, again, this guide is designed for the procurement team, but I think it could be a helpful lens for you as well to see what I'm encouraging procurement teams to be looking for when they're reviewing a VPAT. So again, some of the more detailed pieces of contradictions, for example, are included in that guide. So that might be helpful for you when you're reviewing yours. Another thing that I have in that guide is a template for a procurement team or a VPAT reviewer to complete to help the full procurement team in making decisions. So these are just the bullet points of that reporting template, giving you an idea of what I'm encouraging procurement teams to do when they're evaluating a VPAT. And then this is something that I have created as a supplement to a VPAT. And there's you'll find lots of similar tools out there. This is just Donna Murray's version of a supplementary questionnaire for vendors. Because this, a VPAT is great to tell me the story of your compliance with WCAG standards or your lack of compliance. And while your detailed remarks may include information about your roadmap, your testing methods, this is just another opportunity for you to tell us the full story, not just about compliance, but about your commitment. What is the culture, the commitment to accessibility in your company? Again, I would rather you be honest and say, we are just starting out, but we are, this is our game plan. These are the things we're working on. We've started to identify roles and responsibilities. I am much more apt to lean in to solutions where a company is committed on improvement, continuous improvement, than I am if someone is just vague and in their story about how accessible they are or not and what they're looking to down the road. So this supplementary accessibility questionnaire is something that I designed as a tool for for vendors and for organizations to say, not only are we going to share the VPAT, but this is some more detail about our accessibility commitment. So do you have a published policy statement or a commitment statement about accessibility? If so, share it with us. Don't make us have to go research to see if you have it. If you've got a whole web page devoted to accessibility, let us see it, share that with us so that we can leverage that in our conversations. And then of course, I've asked a few more important questions about your ACR in case you haven't shared it in the ACR, in the VPAT itself. Tell us the detail about who completed it, what methodologies were used, what end user roles were addressed. And then what types of assistive technology devices or screen readers, for example, were used in the evaluation. I'd rather you be honest and say, we didn't use screen readers than for me to just make assumptions. It helps me as we talk about a collaborative partnership. It helps me identify where we have some gaps and how I can work with vendors to make improvements. And then how do people get support? We don't really address that except for any related WCAG standards. We don't really address that in the VPAT. So tell us the story about how does someone who has an accessibility need have that need addressed? So this is just, if you're looking for some other questions to answer to help fully tell the story of accessibility of your solutions and of your company, this might be a helpful tool to answer those questions and include that with your VPAT when you're responding to a solicitation. So here are the key takeaways. Should I even read the first bullet? Support your claims with specific examples. Be detailed as much as possible. When you're transparent, then you are building some trust between yourself and your future customers. And that is tremendous. I think it's a win-win. And that's why I'm devoting a whole webinar specifically around that within the series. And that's our next webinar next week. Acknowledge your gaps, share your roadmap as much as possible, be transparent. And consider more than just the VPAT. If possible, use something like that supplemental question document to tell a greater story, not just about compliance, but about your commitment and your culture. And then, in short, it really is an opportunity for you. It's yes, it's a checklist, and yes, it's something that might be part of a procurement requirement package in your bid response, but it's really an opportunity for you to say, this is who we are through the lens of accessibility. Good, bad, or indifferent, this is who we are, and this is our game plan, because that gives us an entry point into conversations about what we expect and as a customer, and how we can partner to improve together. All right. And so if this is not your first webinar, then this is also not the first time you've seen this picture. I like to tell my personal why for this work. So if this is your first webinar, let me introduce you to Olivia. She will be 20 in a couple of months. This is my daughter. She is quite the mystery. She has physical and cognitive disabilities. And so I have been on this accessibility journey for nearly 2 decades now, and I'm still learning so much, because when you don't know what you don't know, it's difficult to understand what your gaps are when it comes to this topic. So all the more reason for you to be as transparent as possible. If you're new to accessibility, it's probably not because, well, I dare say it's not because you're trying to not meet user needs. That's the business you're in. So I know that's not the case, but oftentimes it's just because you don't know what you don't know. So learn about accessibility and know that the reason behind it are for people, not just the Olivias of the world, but for those who have invisible disabilities. Also, it's just good user design. It's universal design to be able to remove barriers proactively. But for me, there's a very personal attachment to this work. And that is, as a parent and as an educator and as someone who works in the land of procurement for all solutions for not only school districts, but for state government agencies, it's about it's a priority for me, because I have a personal and professional passion about removing barriers proactively. So that's Olivia. She is my why. I do have a full website, chock full of resources, and it's growing every day. In fact, I have added resources just recently from the very first webinar in this series, because those were my the folks who attended that webinar. That was the first time anyone had seen some of the resources I had created for vendors. So if you're interested, the Digital Accessibility website has lots of resources, but I encourage you, if nothing else, to go to the procurement section. There's lots of resources for procurement teams, but I also have a growing section of resources down here specifically for vendors. So I encourage you to take a look at those. And here are some related resources around accessibility conformance reports. And the last 2 webinars in the series will take place on April 1st and April 8th. We're going to talk about collaboration. And then if you are an ed tech vendor and are potentially supplying or looking to supply solutions in the landscape of education, then I encourage you to join the session on April 8th, because we're going to talk about the additional lens to accessibility that we need to address, which is ensuring that for our students with disabilities, we are ensuring that we have alternative formats available to students. So we'll talk about some student-facing specific accessibility needs in that last webinar. Okay. So thank you so much for joining. I'll stay on the call in case anyone has any questions, and I will put the link to the slide deck again in the chat, and I hope to see you again on April 1st. Thanks for joining and for staying after, those of you that could. I will post the recording as soon as I have the transcript ready.